Today, this place is quiet, but for almost 2 centuries, these walls enclosed generations of women and children, people who were confined, classified, and in many cases, separated from their families. In 1821, convict women entered a new institution behind high stone walls. Some arrived with their children. For some, those children would eventually be separated from them. And when the female factory closed in 1848, this place did not fall silent. The institutional life of this landscape continued for generations. People came and went. The buildings changed. The purpose changed. But the place remained. So why did this one landscape become an institution again and again? And what can its history tell us about the way Australia decided who needed to be cared for, protected, and controlled? In the early 19th century, Parramatta was becoming one of the most important centres of the growing colony of New South Wales. As the colony expanded, so did the number of women transported to Australia. Many were placed into a system that assigned their labour to private households and businesses. Others were considered unsuitable for assignment, were waiting to be placed, or had been returned to government control. By the early 1820s, the existing arrangements were struggling to accommodate the growing number of convict women. The answer was a purpose-built complex on the edge of Parramatta. It was designed to house women, organise their labour, provide medical care, manage pregnancy and childbirth, and regulate their movement into the wider colonial workforce. On the 21st of February, 1821, 109 convict women and 71 children entered the new female factory. Behind its walls, Parramatta had created more than a place of confinement. It was a system through which the colonial government could organise where women lived, where they worked, and how they moved through the colonial system. The female factory was the colony's answer to a growing problem. As increasing numbers of convict women arrived in New South Wales, the colonial government needed their labour, but it also wanted to control how that labour was used. Women waiting for assignment, unable to be placed, returned from private service, pregnant, sick, or considered difficult to manage, could come under government control. The first female factory at Parramatta had already become overcrowded. So, the colonial government constructed a larger, purpose-built complex designed not simply to confine women, but to classify them, employ them, discipline them, and for some, prepare them for assignment into colonial society. The factory was not simply a place to hold women, it was a system for deciding what happened to them next. Construction began in 1818 during Governor Lachlan Macquarie's administration. The architect associated with the complex was Francis Greenway, one of the most important architects of early colonial New South Wales. The factory stood close to the river and within reach of Parramatta. Enclosed by substantial stone walls, it contained sleeping quarters, work areas, kitchens, a hospital, and other spaces that organised institutional life. The architecture reflected the system inside. The women were divided into different classes according to their status, behaviour, and circumstances. Women awaiting assignment or considered suitable for employment could be placed in a higher class. Pregnant women, nursing mothers, and women returned from private service could be placed in another. Those considered repeat offenders could be placed in the lowest class, where discipline was harsher and work could be more demanding. Classification was not simply a label. It could determine where a woman slept, what work she performed, how she was treated, and whether she was considered ready to return to the wider colony. Inside the factory, a woman's place was determined not only by where she had come from, but by the category the institution assigned to her. The surviving punishment records make this system unusually visible. They record names, ships, classes, offences, and punishments, reducing individual lives to entries within an administrative system. The factory could organise hundreds of lives, but its records rarely tell us what those lives felt like from the inside. And classification was only one part of the system. The factory also controlled women's labour. Inside its workshops, women produced cloth and linen, worked with wool, sewed, cooked, and washed. Some of this work supported the institution. Some supplied the wider colony. Through the assignment system, convict women could be sent into private households and workplaces. Inside its walls, their labour was controlled by the government. Outside them, that same labour was valuable to the colonial economy. The factory, therefore, stood between two worlds, government control and private employment. It helped determine when a woman could move from one world to the other, but the women inside the factory were not simply workers or convicts. Some were mothers. Pregnancy and childbirth were part of life inside the institution. The factory operated a lying-in hospital, and midwives worked there during its early years. One of them was Mary Jones, who had arrived in New South Wales as a convict in 1814 and was working as a government midwife at Parramatta by the early 1820s. Some mothers lived in the factory with their young children, and the institution even had an infant school for children still living with their mothers, but this arrangement could not continue indefinitely. Children of women in the factory were generally transferred into the orphan school system at around 3 or 4 years of age. A mother could remain under government control while her child was moved into another institution, sending their lives along separate paths through the colonial system. One family could become 2 institutional histories. The government could provide for childbirth and infant care while also determining when a child would enter another institution. For nearly 3 decades, the factory served a changing colony before closing in 1848, yet its closure did not end the institutional life of the site. The buildings and land remained, and the former factory became part of a new system. The Parramatta Lunatic Asylum was established here. The purpose had changed. The institution was now associated with the care and confinement of people with mental illness, operating under different ideas and laws. The asylum was not the female factory, but the same landscape was now being used to manage a different population under a different system. And that is where the larger question begins. Why did Parramatta repeatedly become a place where people who could not, or were not permitted to, remain within ordinary society were placed under institutional care? The answer begins with what happened after the female factory closed. As the asylum developed, new buildings and facilities were added across the surrounding landscape, creating a much larger complex for the treatment, accommodation, and management of people with mental illness. What had once been built for convict women was reshaped for a different population. New wards, boundaries, and routines replaced the old. The landscape was becoming an institutional district, but this was not happening at Parramatta alone. The 19th century was changing the way Australia understood mental illness. Governments increasingly established specialised institutions where people with mental illness could receive treatment within controlled environments, separated from the wider population. Parramatta became one of those places. The language had changed. The institution was no longer organised around convict assignment, but life inside was still shaped by rules, routines, staff, architecture, and restricted movement. The purpose was different from the female factory, but institutional power remained, and the asylum was only part of what was developing around it. Children were placed in orphan schools. Women and men were treated within separate institutional systems. Later, girls would also be brought into the same landscape. Parramatta was no longer defined by a single institution. It had become a landscape of institutions. Children had been part of this landscape from the beginning. Some entered the female factory with their mothers, while others were placed in separate orphan institutions. As the 19th century progressed, government and religious organisations developed specialised institutions for children considered orphaned, abandoned, neglected, or in need of institutional care. The Roman Catholic orphan school became one of the major institutions within this landscape. Who should decide where a child belongs, and what kind of life that child should have? In 1887, the former Roman Catholic orphan school site became the Parramatta Industrial School for girls. The institution was intended for girls classified by authorities as neglected, destitute, uncontrollable, or otherwise in need of institutional care and discipline. These were girls rather than convict women, but the state still determined where they would live, how they should behave, how they would be educated, and when they could return to ordinary society. An industrial school was not simply a school in the modern sense. Education was combined with practical training, discipline, and institutional supervision. For girls classified as difficult or uncontrollable, the boundary between welfare and punishment could become difficult to distinguish. In 1912, Bethel House, the former hospital building, was adapted as a separate training home for younger girls, while the remaining institution continued as the girls' training school. The system was increasingly divided according to age, behaviour, and perceived needs. By the middle of the 20th century, it operated under the Child Welfare Act 1939. The Parramatta Training School for Girls was responsible for the reception, detention, maintenance, discipline, education, and training of young people committed to its care. Education, training, discipline, detention. The institution was expected to prepare girls for life beyond its walls, but it also had the legal authority to keep them within them. the girls who entered did not all arrive for the same reasons. Royal Commission evidence later described girls considered neglected, girls regarded as uncontrollable, and young people who had entered the juvenile justice system. But those labels came from authorities. They tell us how the institution classified the girls, not necessarily who those girls were. For decades, much of the surviving record was written by the institution itself: reports, registers, rules, classifications. But in 2014, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse held a public hearing examining former residents of Parramatta Training School for Girls and the Institution for Girls in Hay. 16 former residents of Parramatta Girls gave evidence. Their testimony brought a different kind of historical record into the story: the memories of people who had lived inside the institution. Former residents described rules governing even small details of daily life. Some recalled being expected not to speak unless spoken to. Others described restrictions on movement and when they could use the toilet. Inside the institution, even everyday life could become a system of rules. The Royal Commission also heard evidence of physical punishment, isolation, and allegations of sexual abuse involving former residents and staff. It examined what happened when concerns were raised. Who knew? Who was told? What action was taken? These accounts changed how the institution could be understood. The history was no longer only about the rules the institution created. It was also about the people who lived under them and what happened when the system failed to protect them. But there was another dimension to who entered this system. Some Aboriginal girls arrived at Parramatta after being removed from their families under the policies of the time. One documented survivor, Woodrow, was removed from her mother at the age of 2 by the Aborigines Protection Board, sent to Cootamundra Girls' Home, and later transferred to Parramatta Industrial School after being classified as uncontrollable. Her story shows how different institutions could become connected in the life of a single child: removal, institution, transfer, classification, separation from family. For these girls, Parramatta could become one part of a much longer history of separation from family, community, and culture. Institutional records can tell us where a child was sent. They cannot always measure what was lost along the way. Family, language, culture, country, connection. Current NSW government research into the Parramatta site records that Aboriginal girls living there had limited opportunities to practice culture, including language. For stolen generation survivors, the history of Parramatta is also a history of what happened when family and culture were placed on the other side of an institutional wall, but the story is also being preserved by the people who lived it. Former residents created Paragirls, a survivor-led organisation dedicated to remembering the women and girls who passed through the institution. In 2026, the NSW government began construction of a keeping place at Keller House, developed in partnership with Stolen Generation survivors to support truth-telling, healing, and the preservation of survivor stories. The people once controlled by these institutions are now helping shape how their history is remembered. But there is another record of Parramatta that was never written by the government. It was left in the ground. In 2016 and 2017, archaeologists carried out a 9-month program of Aboriginal and historical archaeological testing across more than 21 hectares of the North Parramatta institutional landscape. More than 5,000 objects were recovered. Some were fragments of ordinary things people used every day, objects that had been lost, discarded, or forgotten. Together, they offered something the official records often could not: evidence of everyday life. The written record tells us what authorities chose to document. Archaeology can reveal what people actually left behind. Among the objects were combs and toothbrushes associated with female residents of the industrial school. Some had been deliberately marked by the women and girls who used them. Messages had been inscribed into objects never intended to become historical evidence. And suddenly, the archaeology becomes personal. These were no longer simply objects from an institution. They were traces left by the people who lived there. The inscriptions reveal things institutional documents rarely capture: affection, friendship, attachment. The institution recorded the girls as residents. The archaeology allows us to see them as individuals. But archaeology has limits. A comb or a toothbrush cannot reconstruct an entire life. That is why archaeology must be read alongside the written archive, historical research, and survivor testimony. Together, they allow a fuller and more reliable history to emerge. The evidence left behind was not the only thing that survived. The institutional landscape itself continued into the 20th century. By the 1970s, the Parramatta Girls' Training School had operated for decades, but criticism of conditions was growing. In 1974, the Girls' Training School closed. The institution was reorganised. Cumberland was established for girls with emotional or behavioural problems, while Taldry served as a separate children's shelter for boys. The names changed. The buildings remained. In 1980, the former Parramatta Girls' Home became the Norma Detention Centre for Women. Cumberland continued until 1983, when the wider complex became known as Cumberland Hospital. A former orphan school, a girls' institution, a detention centre and a psychiatric hospital had occupied different parts of the same landscape. One landscape, different generations, different forms of institutional life. The Norma Centre ceased operating as a detention centre in 2008. Almost 2 centuries of state and church-run institutions had left behind buildings, archaeological remains, records and memories. The institutions had closed. The evidence remained. Today, the surviving sandstone walls, former wards, corridors, courtyards, archaeological remains and archival records form more than a collection of old buildings. They form a physical record of how Australia's ideas about punishment, welfare, medicine, childhood and social control changed over time. In 2017, the Parramatta Female Factory and Institutions Precinct was placed on the National Heritage List, recognising its importance to the history of women and children in institutions, its archaeological evidence, and its nearly 2 centuries of institutional history. That changes the question. We are no longer asking whether these buildings should simply be preserved because they are old. We are asking what historical evidence they still contain, and whose stories that evidence should help us remember. Not every story can be reconstructed completely. Some records were never created, some were lost, and some voices were not heard when they should have been. The gaps in the record are part of the history too. For generations, much of the story was written by governments and institutions. Today, historians, archaeologists, descendants, and survivors are helping to interpret the same evidence from different perspectives. The history belongs not only to those who built these institutions, but also to the people who endured them. So why did one place keep becoming an institution? There was never a single answer. The Female Factory managed convict women and their labour. The asylum served a different system of mental health care. Orphan schools and later girls' institutions brought new populations into the same landscape. The institutions changed because Australia changed, but the underlying question remained. What should a society do with people it considers vulnerable, difficult, dependent, or outside the ordinary social order? Parramatta North became one of the places where Australia repeatedly answered that question through institutions. No single source tells the whole story. The buildings, archaeology, records, and testimony reveal different parts of it. It is the place itself that connects them. Today, most of the institutions are gone. Some memories are difficult. Some are incomplete. Some survived only after decades of silence. Australia moved from convict factories to asylums, orphan schools and training institutions, toward modern ideas of welfare and individual rights. Some changes represented genuine progress. Others exposed failures that had remained hidden for years. But the history of Parramatta reveals something that goes beyond the institutions themselves. Institutions are about power. Who makes decisions, who gets to leave, whose voice is heard, and what happens when the people inside have less power than those who control them. That is why the history of this place still matters. Parramatta Female Factory is no longer what it was in 1821. The institutions have changed, the city has changed, Australia has changed, but the place remains, and the walls, records, archaeology and memories still tell us something about the people who passed through this landscape. This is not simply the story of a forgotten institution, it is the story of a country learning, sometimes painfully, what it means to care for people, and what can happen when care becomes control. Every place has a story. We find the ones quietly disappearing. Thank you for watching Beneath Australia. If you want to discover more of the Australia that lies beneath the surface, subscribe to the channel.